Okay, this this is a good one. Okay, is there any federal statute that will require or force a school district to administer the Connors test for ADHD? My district says that my child does have ADHD because they observed my child for 1 hour and then didn't present any behaviors that they considered to be ADHD. I'm assuming that you should have wrote doesn't. Your district says that the child doesn't have ADHD because they observed your child for 1 hour and claimed that your child didn't present any behaviors that considered to be ADHD. Your child has a medical diagnosis for ADHD and the school requires an educational diagnosis. That's the part I'm about to get to, guys, because they do the same thing for autism. I'm going to sit there and unravel that for you. I'm stuck in purgatory because the district won't test my child or administer the one test that they will accept. I cannot afford to have a third party administer this test to my child, which isn't your responsibility, by the way. It's theirs to fully evaluate. It's not your job, okay? Therefore, I am trying to find a federal statute to force the district to administer the Connors. Do you know of any such statute or precedent? Yeah, I mean, it's called the IDEA, and I know I'm being sort of cheeky, but understand that the school requirement under the evaluation section of the IDEA is that they have to give your child a variety of assessments, and even to the point where it needs to be a variety of assessments that will produce the most reliable results, even in the child's preferred mode of communication. So it goes to that level. Now, I am in every state, observation is just one component of the eligibility requirement, guys. Let's say structured or unstructured observations. But then the big one for ADHD is they have to give rating scales, which would be sort of like the Connors. They can use the Basque. There's different kinds of behavior and adaptive rating scales that the schools are required to use. All right. So the diagnostic piece that you receive privately, your child has ADHD, and the school can't sit there and say, well, your child doesn't have ADHD. Your child has ADHD because your child has a diagnostic, but at the same time, what does educational ADHD look like? And what does educational autism look like? It doesn't look like anything, guys. What they're saying is that under the education, state education or federal IDEA minimal requirements to qualify under other health impairment, which includes ADHD or under autism, that the educational requirements to meet the eligibility requirements for that specific category have not been met. That does not mean that your child doesn't have ADHD or your child doesn't have autism. It just means that some of those additional requirements that your state put in as minimal thresholds to qualify under other health impairment or under autism have not been met. Now, what are some of those that are constantly tripping up parents attempting to get their child eligible? Rating scales and the observations. Now, why is it that, let's say, a child with ADHD wouldn't qualify? Medication is a big one. And many parents will medicate and they'll say, but my child has ADHD. Well, your child has to display their disability in such a way that it has a negative impact on their educational performance. Because that's why a child requires an IEP, is that their disability, their qualifying disability is impacting them in such a negative way inside their educational setting that it's requiring a need for specialized instruction, i.e. special education in an IEP in order to address. All right. Outside of that, it's accommodations, and that's 504. So an IEP is that next step that my child requires specialized instruction, not just accommodations. So that's where that additional threshold comes in. And many parents will medicate their children and say, well, why doesn't my kid qualify for an IEP? Because the diagnosis alone doesn't mean that the child qualifies. They also have to display that their disability does negatively impact the child across their educational performance areas. But if the medication's a mitigating factor, yes, the school's not technically supposed to consider that. But if they've never seen your child off of medication, then they cannot fill out these rating scales appropriately. And I don't blame the school personnel for that. So it's a double-edged sword. And many schools will sit there and say, well, we want your child on medication. Well, of course they do. You get to deal with your child not on medication. So that's why there's also this disconnect to where the parents are saying, but at home, but at home, but at home. And the school's saying, well, not at school. We have a perfect angel at school. That's because the kid's medicated at school. And the kid is also able to keep it together. And that's a lot of ADHD kids. They're able to sit there and keep it together and bottle it up. And then they release it home. And, sit there and parents go, well, what about what's going on at home? It's having a negative impact and it's sourced at school. Yeah, guys, we deal with that all the time, and I don't have an easy answer, because I can tell you when it comes to some of these disabilities like autism and ADHD, some of these components, minimal components to have the child eligible are very subjective. And to sit there and file a complaint and take it to court and sit there and say, well, this teacher's a liar in her or his perspective of how the child acts at school, that's a very, very, very risky allegation to make when somebody is filling out a rating scale based upon their perspective. All right, unless you have a bunch of, let's say, texts and other notes that this particular teacher has been sending home complaining for the last 3 months about your child's behavior, but yet the behavior rating scales are reporting something completely different, it's a little bit easier to make that argument. But if the child is fully medicated, then that's going to be one of the major components as to why the rating scales aren't coming back. But in your case, they should be given that. They shouldn't be sitting there telling you, well, based upon this one observation. The observation alone is not a reason not to do the behavior rating scales. Okay? And you can make that request once a year, guys, to have your child reevaluated. But you need to sit there and make sure that those other components are there. That there's something that you can point to where it's having a negative impact on your child at school. You can't necessarily say it's having a negative impact on my child at home, because the school personnel will sit there and say, well, it needs to be at school. And in large part, that's accurate. Okay? So keep that in mind. But in your case, it's the federal law. It's not necessarily, you're not going to find a statute that says you must give the Connors. It just says that they must fully evaluate, and they must use a variety of assessment methods to do so. And the minimal components in your state is going to include a rating scale similar to the Connors, and they can do that. You don't have a responsibility financially to go and diagnose your own child. They do.